The neon pulse of the Seoul skyline bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Han penthouse, but the air inside remained as cold as a tomb. Zuri Caldwell sat motionless on the edge of the oversized silk bed, her fingers digging into the intricate white lace of her gown until the delicate threads bit into her palms. At 23, she was supposed to be a bride at the height of her joy. Instead, her reflection in the vanity mirror looked like a ghost haunting its own wedding. Her deep brown complexion was vibrant against the ivory silk, but her eyes were glossy, heavy with the weight of tears she refused to let fall. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop. She had been searching for a glass of water to soothe the dry ache in her throat when a voice, sharp, masculine, and utterly devoid of warmth, cut through the heavy mahogany doors of the balcony. "I never wanted her," Han Seojin said. Each word landed like a physical blow against Zuri's chest. "She's a contract, not a wife. A financial insurance policy I was forced to sign to keep the syndicate's assets untouchable." Zuri froze, her breath hitching as she pressed a trembling hand against the pearl-encrusted bodice of her dress. Through the glass, she could see Seojin's silhouette. He stood upright, radiating a silent, terrifying authority in his black luxury suit. He didn't look like a man who had just taken a lifelong vow. He looked like a businessman who had just closed a tedious deal. "Then why the elaborate ceremony, boss?" his lieutenant asked, his voice low. "Because her father's international influence is the only shield the Han family has left," Seojin replied, his gaze fixed on the city below. "I'll fulfill the obligation of the name. I'll give her the title of Mrs. Han, but my heart, that still belongs to Minhee. I'll be at her apartment by midnight." The rustle of Zuri's lace gown felt like a mockery as the sound of the balcony door sliding shut echoed through the room. A moment later, the distant roar of a sports car engine signaled his departure. Zuri's father had promised her a gilded shield, a marriage that would make her untouchable. He had forgotten to mention that the most dangerous thing in this glass fortress wouldn't be the enemies at the gate, but the man who had just left her alone on their wedding night. "Hello, family. How are you doing? Before we proceed with the story, I would like to know where you are watching from. Drop it in the comments and also subscribe to this channel if you are new here." Now let's go back into the story. The first rays of the Seoul sun did not bring warmth to the Han estate. Instead, they cast long, jagged shadows across the cold marble of the master suite. Zuri awoke alone, the vast expanse of the silk sheets beside her undisturbed and perfectly pressed. The scent of Seojin's expensive, woody cologne still lingered in the air, a haunting reminder of the man who had vanished into the night to find a woman he actually desired. Her wedding gown lay discarded over a velvet chair like the shed skin of a person she no longer recognized. When Zuri finally descended the grand staircase, her deep brown complexion was set in a mask of practiced calm, though her heart felt like a bruised thing behind her ribs. She had traded the lace for a simple, elegant sheath dress, her voluminous natural curls gathered loosely, yet she felt the weight of 1,000 eyes upon her. The estate was a hive of activity, a glass fortress maintained by a staff that moved with the silent, lethal efficiency of the syndicate they served. As she entered the dining hall, the soft clatter of silverware stopped abruptly. Two maids, busy polishing a silver tea service, ducked their heads, but not before Zuri caught the sharp, pitying glint in their eyes. "She's still here," one whispered in a hushed Korean dialect, unaware that Zuri had spent months studying the language in preparation for this life. "I heard the master's car didn't return until 4 in the morning. He didn't even go to the guest wing. He went straight to the study to change for his meetings." "Why would he stay?" the other replied with a cruel, stifled giggle. "Minhee is the one he calls. This one is just the Caldwell Bank account in address. She'll be lucky if he remembers her name by breakfast." Zuri's posture remained upright, her chin tilted at an angle of quiet defiance, but the words hit her with the sting of 1,000 paper cuts. She sat at the head of a table built for 20, the silence of the room amplified by the ticking of a grand clock that seemed to count down the seconds of her isolation. A butler placed a plate of delicately prepared food before her, his expression a blank slate of professional indifference. He didn't offer a "Congratulations, Mrs. Han." He didn't even meet her gaze. In this house, she was a ghost, a strategic necessity to be maintained but never truly seen. Restless, Zuri spent the afternoon navigating the labyrinthine hallways of her new prison. Every turn revealed more of the Han family's staggering wealth. Priceless Celadon vases, modern art that cost more than a small country's GDP, and security cameras that followed her every move with unblinking red eyes. She found herself in the estate's massive library, a room that smelled of old parchment and filtered sunlight. It was here that she found the first cracks in the Han family's impenetrable armor. While browsing the shelves, she stumbled upon a hidden alcove containing the syndicate's historical ledgers. Her father had sent her here to be a shield, but he had also raised her to be a master of numbers. As she pulled a heavy volume from the shelf, a photograph fluttered out. It was a younger Seojin, his sharp features less hardened by the world, standing beside a woman with a sharp, predatory beauty, Minhee. They looked like a matched set, two creatures born of blood and shadow. Zuri traced the edge of the photo, a hollow ache building in her chest. She was an outsider in every sense of the word. She didn't share their history, their language of violence, or their cold, granite-carved faces. To Seojin, she was a soft, vibrant intrusion into a world that only valued steel. The sound of heavy footsteps echoing in the hallway made her pulse race. She quickly replaced the photo and stepped out of the alcove just as Seojin appeared in the doorway. He was dressed in a different suit now, charcoal gray, fitted with a lethal precision that emphasized his broad shoulders and commanding aura. His face was a mask of exhausted intensity. He stopped when he saw her, his narrowed, focused eyes scanning her from head to toe. For a fleeting second, his gaze lingered on the natural curve of her hair, and a flicker of something unfamiliar and quickly suppressed passed through his expression. "The staff said you were wandering," he said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that vibrated in the quiet room. He didn't step closer. The distance between them felt like a canyon. "I was exploring my home, Seojin," Zuri replied, her voice steady despite the electricity crackling in the air. He let out a short, humorless breath. "This is a fortress, Zuri, not a home. Don't get the two confused." "Is that why you left last night?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. "Because the fortress felt too small." Seojin's jaw tightened, the dragon tattoo on the side of his neck appearing to darken as the muscle moved. "I have obligations that don't concern you. Your father was paid for your presence here. Be content with the safety I provide." "Safety is a cold comfort when it comes with a cage," Zuri shot back, her glossy eyes burning with a sudden, fierce light. Seojin took a single step forward, his presence suddenly dominating the room, radiating a silent authority that made the air feel heavy. He looked at her not as a wife, but as a complicated problem he hadn't yet solved. "You are Mrs. Han. That is your shield. As long as you wear that name, no one can touch you, but do not expect me to play the part of the doting husband. I told you, I never wanted this." He turned on his heel and walked away, his silhouette disappearing into the shadows of the hallway. Zuri stood in the center of the library, the silence returning twofold. She could hear the faint whispers of the maids in the distance, their laughter drifting up from the kitchens. She was the queen of the Han syndicate, surrounded by gold and guarded by iron, yet as she looked out at the darkening soul sky, she had never felt more like a target. She realized then that Seojin was right. She was a financial insurance policy. But as she gripped the edge of a mahogany desk, her eyes narrowed with a newfound resolve. He thought she was a fragile girl to be stored away in a gilded room. He didn't realize that a Caldwell didn't just survive in a fortress. They learned how to run it. The Seoul Grand Ballroom was a cathedral of glass and gold. shimmering with the deceptive brilliance of 1,000 crystal chandeliers. It was the night of the Blue Moon Gala, an event where the city's elite gathered to hide their sins behind designer masks and charitable donations. For Zuri, it was her official introduction to society as the wife of Han Seojin, and she had prepared for it like a soldier donning armor. She wore a floor-length gown of midnight navy that draped over her curves like liquid silk, her natural curls pinned back with diamond clips that caught the light with every turn of her head. She stood at the edge of the grand staircase, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Seojin had sent a car for her but had not shared it. He had cited urgent business and told her to meet him at the venue. As she descended the stairs alone, the whispers began. They were the same whispers she had heard in the hallways of the estate, now amplified by the hollow acoustics of the ballroom. "The Caldwell heiress," a woman in a crimson dress murmured, shielding her mouth with a silk fan. "Look at her. She looks like a queen, but she's standing alone. Where is the dragon?" Zuri kept her gaze level, her chin tilted high. She moved through the crowd with a grace that masked her internal collapse, accepting glasses of champagne she didn't drink and nodding to people who looked through her as if she were made of glass. She was searching for the one person who was supposed to be her shield, but the sea of tuxedos and evening gowns yielded nothing but cold stares. The atmosphere in the room shifted suddenly, the air growing heavy with a collective intake of breath. The grand doors at the far end of the hall swung open, and the crowd parted like a tide. Zuri turned, her breath hitching in her throat. Han Seojin entered the room, radiating a silent, terrifying authority in a charcoal tuxedo that seemed to absorb the light around him. But he wasn't alone. Draped over his arm, her fingers interlaced with his with a possessive familiarity, was Minhee. The mistress wore a gown of daring scarlet, her sharp, predatory beauty on full display. She leaned into Seojin's side, whispering something into his ear that made a ghost of a smile touch his granite-carved features, a smile Zuri had never once received. The insult was calculated and absolute. It was a public execution of Zuri's dignity. Zuri felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her deep brown complexion ashen under the sapphire lights. She was the wife, the woman who carried the Han name, yet she stood in the shadows of a marble pillar while the woman Seojin truly wanted occupied the space at his side. The irony was suffocating. Her father had bought her this marriage to make her untouchable. Yet here she was, being ravaged by the silent judgment of an entire city. She watched as Seojin led Minhee toward the head table, ignoring the gasps and the frantic snapping of socialite cameras. He didn't look for Zuri. He didn't scan the room to ensure his wife was safe. He walked as if she didn't exist, as if the contract they had signed was written in disappearing ink. Minhee's eyes found Zuri across the distance. The mistress didn't look away. Instead, she offered a slow, triumphant smirk and raised her glass in a mocking toast. It was a declaration of war, played out on a stage of silk and diamonds. "Mrs. Han." Zuri started, turning to find a young waiter holding a tray. He looked at her with a flicker of genuine pity, the only honest emotion she had encountered all night. "Would you like to be seated? Your chair is," at the main table. Zuri looked at the table where Seojin and Minhee sat, surrounded by the syndicate's highest-ranking lieutenants. To sit there would be to invite a slow death by 1,000 stares. To stay in the shadows was to admit defeat. She took a steadying breath, the soft presence Seojin so despised hardening into something forged in fire. She didn't head for the table. Instead, she walked toward the balcony, the cool night air of Seoul calling to her. She needed the dark. She needed to remind herself that she was a Caldwell, and Caldwells didn't crumble under the weight of a husband's cruelty. As she stepped onto the terrace, the muffled music of the ballroom fatting behind her, she realized that Seojin had succeeded in his goal. He had shown the world that she was nothing to him. But as she gripped the stone railing, looking out over the sprawling, neon-lit empire she was now tethered to, Zuri realized something he hadn't. By casting her into the shadows, he had given her the perfect vantage point. She could see everything. The vultures leaning in to whisper to Minhee, the nervous glances of the guards, and the predatory way the rival families watched Seojin's back. He thought he was spitting her by choosing his mistress. He didn't realize that by leaving his wife in the dark, he had left himself completely unguarded. The cool night air on the balcony had been a brief sanctuary, but it offered no protection against the storm that was brewing. By the time the gala began to wind down, Seojin had already vanished again, leaving Zuri to find her own way back to the hollow silence of the estate. She did not go to sleep. Instead, she sat in the darkened library, the weight of the evening's humiliation pressing into her chest like a physical stone. She watched the GPS tracker on her phone, a security measure her father had insisted upon, tethering her to Seojin's car. She watched the little glowing dot settle at a high-end apartment complex in the Gangnam district, Minhee's home. Zuri was about to set the phone down when the dot began to move erratically. Then, the silent security alert on her tablet flared to life. The Han Syndicate's private frequency erupted with panicked, coded chatter. There was an intercept, an ambush. She didn't stop to think. The submissive bride was replaced by a woman who had spent a lifetime watching her father manage crises. She shed her navy gown, pulling on dark leggings and a heavy jacket, and grabbed the professional-grade trauma kit she had insisted on keeping in the trunk of her own discreet sedan. As she sped through the rain-slicked streets of Seoul, the sky opened up, a torrential downpour washing away the city's neon glow. The scene at the apartment complex was a nightmare of twisted metal and shattered glass. Seojin's armored SUV had been rammed onto the sidewalk, smoke curling from its hood. Shadows moved through the rain, gunmen from a rival faction closing in to finish the job. Zuri saw Seojin stumble out of the wreckage, his charcoal tuxedo jacket shredded and soaked in blood. He dragged himself toward the reinforced glass doors of Minhee's lobby, his hand pressed against a jagged wound in his side. Inside the lobby, behind the safety of the bulletproof glass, Zuri saw a flash of scarlet silk. Minhee stood there, her face contorted not with grief, but with sheer, paralyzed terror. As Seojin reached for the door, his bloody palms smearing against the glass, Minhee didn't reach out to help. She didn't trigger the manual override. Instead, her eyes met Seojin's for one horrific second, before she turned the heavy deadbolt and backed away into the shadows of the elevator, leaving him to the wolves. A surge of protective fury Zuri didn't know she possessed eclipsed her fear. She swung her sedan around the corner, tires screaming against the asphalt, and placed her car as a physical barrier between the approaching gunmen and her husband. The roar of the engine and the blinding flash of her high beams momentarily scattered the attackers. "Get in," she screamed over the thunder, throwing the passenger door open. Seojin looked up, his face a mask of shock and agony, his narrowed eyes struggling to focus through the crimson rain. He collapsed into the seat, and Zuri floored it, the car fishtailing before catching traction and disappearing into the darkness of a side alley. She didn't drive to the hospital. The vultures would be waiting there. She pulled into a secluded, underground parking garage her father owned for his private couriers. The overhead light flickered with a sickly yellow hue as she killed the engine. The only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the cooling metal and Seojin's ragged, wet gasps. "Zuri," he rasped, his hand clutching her arm, his fingers leaving dark stains on her jacket. "Why?" "Shut up, Seojin," she commanded, her voice vibrating with a lethal efficiency he had never heard. She didn't look like the girl who had wept on the bed. She looked like a surgeon. She tore open his shirt, the sight of the deep, tearing wound in his abdomen making her stomach flip, but she forced it down. She knew the liver was dangerously close, and the bleeding was arterial. She grabbed the hemostatic gauze from her kit, packing the wound with steady, practiced hands. Seojin let out a choked groan. His head falling back against the headrest, his sharp jawline tight with a pain that would have broken a lesser man. "Min-hee, she locked the door," he whispered, the realization sounding more painful than the wound itself. "I know," Zuri said, her eyes focused entirely on the task of keeping him alive. "I saw." As she applied a pressure bandage, her deep brown hands covered in the blood of the man who had claimed he never wanted her, Seojin reached up. His hand, weak and trembling, caught her chin, forcing her to look at him. His intense gaze was no longer cold. It was filled with a staggering, raw confusion. "You came for me," he breathed, a single drop of rain and blood rolling down his temple. "In the red rain, you were the only one who came." "I'm your wife, Seojin," she replied, her voice softening just enough to betray the ache in her heart. "In my world, that means something even if it doesn't in yours." She finished the dressing and checked his pulse. It was thready but holding. She looked at the blood-stained interior of her car, then at the man who had spent their entire marriage trying to make her feel invisible. For the first time, the dragon looked small. For the first time, he was the one who was vulnerable. Zuri put the car back in gear. The financial insurance policy had just paid out in a way Seojin never expected. She wasn't just his wife anymore, she was his lifeline. And as she drove him toward a safe house known only to her, she knew the war for the Hand Syndicate had truly begun. But this time, she wouldn't be standing in the shadows. The safe house was a sterile, high-tech sanctuary hidden beneath the architectural sprawl of Seoul. But to Zuri, it felt like a command center. Seojin lay in the center of the room, his breathing shallow and hitched, tethered to a rhythmic heart monitor that beeped like a countdown. She had managed to smuggle in a private trauma surgeon, a man who owed her father a debt greater than his own life, to finish what she had started in the rain. Now, the surgery was over, but the war for the Hand Syndicate was just beginning. Zuri sat at a sleek obsidian desk at the foot of his bed, the blue light of 3 separate laptops reflecting in her glossy, determined eyes. She was still wearing the jacket stained with his blood, but her hands no longer trembled. While the vultures in the syndicate were likely gathering in dark boardrooms, assuming the dragon was dead or incapacitated, Zuri was moving through their digital veins. She didn't need a gun to protect him. She had something far more lethal, the Caldwell inheritance of financial intuition. Her fingers flew across the keys, navigating the labyrinth of the Han family's offshore accounts and shell companies. She saw it happening in real time, a coordinated hostile takeover. The rival faction that had ambushed Seojin was now dumping Han stock to tank the price, intending to buy up a controlling interest by dawn. "Not on my watch," she whispered, her voice a low, fierce promise to the unconscious man behind her. Zuri began a counteroffensive. She didn't just buy the stock back. She executed a series of lightning-fast short squeezes, using her father's international liquid assets as a lever to trap the rival faction's capital. She moved with a cold, mathematical ruthlessness that would have made Seojin proud, cutting off their funding lines and freezing their laundered assets in European banks. She was starving the enemy before they could even draw their swords. A low, pained groan from the bed broke her concentration. Zuri was on her feet in an instant, moving to Seojin's side. His face was pale, the sharp, masculine lines of his features softened by the vulnerability of sleep. His eyes flickered open, narrowed and focused even in his delirium. He tried to sit up, his hand immediately flying to the heavy bandage at his side. "Stay down, Seojin," Zuri commanded, her hand pressing gently but firmly against his shoulder. "The surgeon repaired the laceration. You lost too much blood to be stubborn." The board," he rasped, his voice a dry shadow of its usual resonance. "They'll move. Now my uncles, the rivals." "They already moved," Zuri said, pulling a tablet over to show him the cascading red lines of his enemy's failed trades. "And I broke them. By the time the markets open tomorrow, the faction that attacked you will be bankrupt. I've tied their liquid capital into a dead-end merger. They can't pay their gunmen if their accounts are frozen." Seo-jin stared at the screen, then up at Zuri. The distance that had defined their marriage seemed to evaporate in the sterile light of the room. He looked at her deep brown skin, her natural curls, and the sharp intelligence burning in her gaze. He saw the financial insurance policy for the first time, not as a contract, but as a titan. You did this from a laptop," he whispered, a flicker of awe crossing his face. "I told you, Seo-jin. My father didn't just buy me a shield, he taught me how to forge one," she replied. She reached for a glass of water, lifting his head carefully to help him drink. "Minhee didn't call the hospital. She didn't call your lieutenants. She called her jeweler to see if she could sell the watch you gave her before the accounts were locked." Seo-jin's eyes closed briefly as the weight of that betrayal settled. When he opened them again, they were fixed on Zuri with an intensity that made her breath hitch. The electricity between them, once sparked by anger, was now fueled by a profound, begrudging respect. "I spent my life surrounded by people who swore they'd die for me," Seo-jin said, his voice stronger now, though still strained. "But when the red rain came, they all ran, except for the woman I treated like a stranger." He reached out, his fingers brushing against her hand, the one still resting on the bed. His touch was no longer cold, it was tentative, almost reverent. "I said I never wanted you, Zuri. I was a fool. I didn't know that salvation would look like you." Zuri didn't pull away. She looked at the man who had been her tormentor and was now her charge. She knew the vultures were still out there, and the mistress would not disappear quietly, but for the first time in the glass fortress, Zuri didn't feel like a ghost. She felt like the heartbeat of the empire. "Rest, Seo-jin," she whispered, her thumb brushing over the dragon tattoo on his neck. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm the only guard you have left." The transition from the safe house back to the Han estate was a silent, tactical operation, but the atmosphere within the glass walls had shifted irrevocably. When Seo-jin finally awoke in the familiar surroundings of his own master suite, the sterile scent of the safe house had been replaced by the subtle, comforting aroma of sandalwood and Zuri's vanilla-scented hair oil. He blinked against the morning light, his sharp features tightening as he tested the bandages at his side. The pain was a dull roar now, manageable, but the weight in the room was different. Zuri was not hovering over him with the frantic energy of a frightened wife. Instead, he found her seated at the small mahogany desk near the window, her silhouette framed by the golden soul sunrise. She was dressed in a crisp white shirt, her natural curls gathered at the nape of her neck, and her focus was entirely on the high-end tablet in her hands. She was speaking in low, fluent Korean into a headset, her voice carrying a rhythmic authority that made Seo-jin stay still just to listen. "Tell the logistics team at the port that the freeze is lifted, but only for the Caldwell-authorized shipments," she said, her deep brown eyes scanning a series of complex spreadsheets. "If Director Park calls about the blocked accounts, tell him the glitch will be resolved when I see the signed loyalty affidavits from his board members. Not a second before." She ended the call and let out a soft breath, rubbing her temples. As she turned her chair, she caught Seo-jin watching her. The narrowed, focused gaze that usually intimidated his enemies was now directed at her with a raw, unshielded curiosity. "You're awake," she said, her expression softening as she moved to his bedside. "The doctor said your vitals are stabilizing. You shouldn't be trying to sit up yet." "I heard you on the phone," Seo-jin rasped, his voice still a low, resonant rumble. He gestured vaguely toward the desk. "Director Park is one of the oldest vultures in the syndicate. He doesn't take orders from anyone but me. How did you get him to agree to loyalty affidavits?" Zuri offered a small, knowing smile, one that didn't reach her eyes, which were still guarded by the trauma of the previous nights. "I didn't ask him, Seo-jin. I showed him that I had already moved 30% of his private offshore holdings into a blind trust he can't access without my biometric override. He didn't have a choice. He realized that while you were bleeding, I was the one holding the keys to his retirement." Seo-jin let out a short, dry chuckle that ended in a wince. You didn't just save my life, Zuri. You took my throne. I kept it warm for you, she replied, her hand hovering over his for a second before she pulled back, as if remembering the distance he had demanded. I did what was necessary to ensure that when you stood up, you still had an empire to lead. The room fell into a heavy silence. Seojin looked at the ceiling, the dragon tattoo on his neck pulsing with the slow beat of his heart. Where is Minhee? Zuri took a steadying breath. She had been dreading this moment, but she knew the truth was the only thing that would finish the ghost bride she had been forced to be. She's at the Gangnam apartment. My security team intercepted her calls that night, Seojin. After she locked that lobby door, she didn't call the police. She didn't call the syndicate's medics. Zuri tapped the screen of her tablet and slid it toward him. She called a luxury jeweler to inquire about the resale value of the Patek Philippe you gave her last month. Then she called a private travel agency to check the status of her visa for Switzerland. She wasn't murring you, she was liquidating you. The silence that followed was absolute. Seojin stared at the call logs, his sharp jawline tightening until the bone looked as if it might break through the skin. The woman he had flaunted, the woman he had claimed his heart belonged to, had treated his impending death as a clearance sale. He looked back at Zuri, the woman he had dismissed as merchandise, the woman he had left weeping on her wedding night. She was the one who had driven into a hail of bullets. She was the one who had stayed awake for 48 hours to dismantle a hostile takeover. She was the only thing in his world that wasn't a lie. Zuri, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. He reached out, his hand catching hers before she could move away. His grip was surprisingly strong, his skin warm against hers. I treated you like an intruder in my own home. I let that woman insult you because I wanted to prove I was in control. He pulled her hand toward his chest, resting her palm directly over his heart. I was a fool. I thought strength was about who would bleed for me. I didn't realize it was about who would stay when everyone else ran. Zuri's glossy eyes finally spilled over, a single tear trailing down her cheek. I didn't do it for the Han Syndicate, Seojin. I did it because I was tired of being the only one who saw the man beneath the dragon. Seojin pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers. The electricity that had once been a spark of anger was now a steady, burning flame of devotion. The dragon is dead, he murmured against her skin. There is only us now, and the first thing we do as a pair is clean the house. Zuri looked at the man who had finally seen her, and for the first time since she arrived in Seoul, she didn't feel like a prisoner. She felt like a partner. The awakening was complete. Seojin was back, but the vultures and the mistress were about to find out that the dragon's wife was far more dangerous than the dragon himself. The heavy mahogany doors of the master suite clicked shut, sealing out the prying eyes of the estate staff and the silent judgment of the glass fortress. For months, those doors had been a barrier, a boundary line that Seojin never crossed. But tonight, as the moonlight silvered the edges of the room, the distance between them finally collapsed. Seojin did not head for the guest wing or his isolated study. He moved slowly, his sharp features softened by the dim lighting, and stopped at the foot of the bed where Zuri sat. The tension in the room was no longer the brittle, cold air of a forced merger. It was thick with an unspoken shift in gravity. Zuri watched him, her deep brown eyes tracing the way he moved, still slightly stiff from the bandages, but possessing a newfound groundedness. He wasn't the dragon tonight. He was a man coming home to the only person who hadn't abandoned him in the red rain. The guest wing is being renovated, Seojin said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that vibrated through the quiet space. It was a transparent excuse, a thin veil of Mafia pride that Zuri found surprisingly endearing. Is it? Zuri asked, a soft, knowing smile playing on her lips. She didn't challenge him. She simply shifted, making space on the silk sheets that had only ever known her solitary weight. I hadn't noticed the construction. Seojin let out a short, breathy laugh. the first genuine sound of amusement she had ever heard from him. He sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping under his weight. For a long moment, he just looked at her, his narrowed, focused eyes scanning her face as if he were memorizing a map. He looked at the natural curls he had once ignored and the strength in her shoulders that had carried his entire empire while he lay bleeding. "I spent my whole life thinking that being a boss meant having no vulnerabilities," he whispered, reaching out to trace the line of her jaw with his thumb. His touch was tentative, a stark contrast to the commanding aura he projected to the world. "I thought you were a weakness I was forced to accept. I thought the salvation my father promised in this contract was just financial." He leaned closer, the scent of sandalwood and something uniquely his, sharp and masculine, enveloping her. "I was wrong, Zuri. The accounts you saved, the board members you tamed, that was just business. But when I was in that lobby, watching the woman I thought I loved turn the lock on me, and then I saw your car screeching around that corner, that was something else." Zuri reached up, her hand resting over his on her cheek. "I didn't do it to prove you wrong, Seojin. I did it because I knew that if I didn't, the best part of you would die in that rain, and I wasn't ready to let go of the man I hadn't even met yet." Seojin didn't reply with words. He laid back against the pillows, pulling Zuri into the curve of his arm. It was a possessive, protective gesture, but there was a vulnerability in it that broke her heart. For the first time, he wasn't sleeping like a soldier on high alert. He was resting. His head settled near her shoulder, and she could feel the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart, a heart that beat only because she had refused to let it stop. As the hours passed, and the city of Seoul hummed in the distance, Seojin watched the rise and fall of Zuri's chest. He thought about the vultures, still circling, and the betrayal of Minhee that he still had to settle, but for the first time, the darkness didn't feel overwhelming. He looked at the woman beside him and realized that the financial insurance policy had been a lie told by men who didn't understand true power. Zuri was his salvation, not because of her father's bank accounts, but because she was the only one who saw the man beneath the dragon tattoo and chose to stay. She was the anchor in his storm, the light in his glass prison. As he finally drifted into a deep, restorative sleep, the great shift was complete. The master of the Hand Syndicate was no longer alone. He had a partner, and the world was about to find out exactly what happens when the dragon finally finds something worth fighting for. The sanctuary of the master suite felt like a distant memory the moment Zuri stepped into the high-ceilinged atrium of the Han estate the following afternoon. The great shift had unified her and Seojin behind closed doors, but in the public eyes of the syndicate, the air was thick with the scent of an impending kill. Minhee had appeared at the gates an hour earlier, not with the bowed head of a discarded mistress, but with the frantic, clawing energy of a woman watching her life's ambition dissolve. Zuri watched from the upper mezzanine as Minhee marched toward the dining hall, clutching a designer handbag as if it were a weapon. Zuri didn't descend immediately. Instead, she adjusted the small, wireless earpiece connected to the estate's upgraded security grid, the one she had recalibrated while Seojin slept. She wasn't the soft presence anymore. She was the architect of the fortress. "She's in the tea room," a voice crackled in Zuri's ear, one of the young guards who had shifted his loyalty to the lady of the house after the night of the red rain. "She asked the kitchen staff for the master's herbal blend. She says she wants to make a peace offering for his recovery." Zuri's deep brown eyes narrowed. She knew Minhee's type. A woman who had spent years in the shadow of a dragon didn't offer peace unless it was laced with a sting. Zuri moved silently through the service corridors, arriving at the darkened pantry that overlooked the tea room through a decorative lattice. Through the woodwork, Zuri watched Minhee. The mistress's sharp, predatory beauty was frayed, her eyes darting toward the door as she pulled a small amber vial from her silk lining. With trembling fingers, Minhee uncapped it and let 3 colorless drops fall into the delicate celadon cup intended for Seojin. It wasn't a lethal dose. Minhee wasn't brave enough for murder, but it was a potent sedative that would make Seojin appear to be relapsing, a weakness she could blame on Zuri's incompetent care. But Minhee wasn't finished. She reached into her bag and pulled out a heavy platinum and jade heirloom, the Han family seal that Seo Jin kept in his private safe. She tucked it deep into the cushions of the settee where Zuri usually sat to read. Theft and sabotage, Zuri whispered to herself, a cold, humorless smile touching her lips. How predictable. Zuri stepped out from the shadows just as Minhee was smoothing her dress, a mask of false innocence settling over her face. It's a bit late for tea, don't you think, Minhee? Minhee jumped, her hand flying to her throat. You startled me. I was just preparing something for Seojin. He's been so unwell under your supervision. Zuri walked toward the table, her movements fluid and unafraid. She looked at the steaming cup, then at the mistress. Seojin is resting, and he won't be seeing you, not today and not ever again. You think because you played nurse for one night that you own him, Minhee hissed, her voice dropping to a jagged edge. He'll realize soon enough that you're a thief. I wonder how the syndicate will feel when they find the family seal in your possession. They don't take kindly to outsiders stealing their history. You mean the seal you just tucked into the velvet cushions? Zuri asked, her voice calm and terrifyingly steady. She reached into her own pocket and pulled out a small remote, clicking a button. The wall-mounted television in the room flickered to life, showing a high-definition playback of the last 5 minutes. Minhee watched in frozen horror as her own image, clear and undeniable, poisoned the tea and planted the heirloom. I told you once this is a fortress, Zuri said, stepping into Minhee's personal space. And I run the security. I've already sent this footage to Seojin's tablet and to the board of directors. They don't like vultures who try to weaken the boss during a recovery. The sound of heavy, rhythmic footsteps echoed in the hallway. The doors swung open, and Seojin entered. He was pale, leaning slightly on a cane, but his aura was a suffocating weight of silent authority. He didn't look at the tea. He didn't look at the seal. He looked only at Minhee, his narrowed eyes reflecting a coldness that made the mistress crumble to her knees. Seojin, please. She's framing me, she. Get out, Seojin interrupted, his voice a low, resonant rumble that shook the room. But I love you, Minhee cried, reaching for the hem of his trousers. Seojin stepped back, his expression one of pure, unadulterated disgust. You loved my status. You loved the accounts. But when the red rain came, you locked the door. My wife opened hers. You are nothing to this family now. You are an intruder. He turned to the guard standing at the door. Take her, remove her from the property, and ensure she leaves with exactly what she brought into this life, nothing. As the guards dragged a screaming, hysterical Minhee away, the room fell into a heavy silence. Seojin turned to Zuri, his intense gaze softening as he looked at the woman who had once again protected his flank. He walked over to the settee, retrieved the jade seal, and instead of putting it away, he placed it firmly in Zuri's hand. You were 3 steps ahead, he murmured, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. I have to be, Zuri replied, her glossy eyes meeting his. Because I'm not just a contract anymore. I'm the one who keeps this empire from burning down. Seojin leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. The last stand of the mistress had failed, and in its wake the throne was no longer shared by a boss and a maid. It was held by a king and his salvation. The aftermath of the tea-room confrontation left a chilling stillness in the Han estate, a silence that signaled the beginning of a cold, systematic erasure. Seojin sat in his high-backed leather chair in the study, the shadow of the dragon on his neck appearing jagged under the dim desk lamp. He was no longer the wounded man Zuri had pulled from the rain. He was the executioner. Zuri stood by the window, watching the city lights, her presence a steadying anchor while Seojin wielded the full weight of his authority to dismantle the woman who had tried to poison their future. Seojin's fingers tapped rhythmically on his mahogany desk as he reviewed the final reports. The Gangnam apartment, he said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that carried a terrifying finality. It was never in her name. It was held by a subsidiary of the Han Group. Evict her. Give her 10 minutes to pack a single bag. Change the biometric locks and wipe her access codes from every building in the district. It's done, boss, a voice replied over the intercom, a cold, efficient confirmation from his head of security. Zuri turned, her deep brown eyes reflecting a mix of solemnity and a quiet sense of justice. She had seen the way Minhee looked at her, as if she were a disposable object, and now she watched as Seo-jin treated the mistress with the same clinical detachment. He wasn't just breaking a heart, he was unmaking a person. The car, Seo-jin continued, his narrowed, focused eyes fixed on the ledger before him. The red convertible, it's a company asset. Have it towed while she's still inside the building. And the bank accounts, the ones I seeded for her security. Drain them. Everyone, every cent. Move the balance into the Caldwell Restitution Fund Zuri established this morning. He looked up at Zuri, a ghost of a grim smile touching his sharp features. If she wants to live a life of luxury, she can find someone else to pay for the privilege. But in this city, no one will dare take a call from a woman the Han Syndicate has marked as forgotten. By midnight, the reality of Seo-jin's ruthlessness hit the streets of Gangnam. Minhee was cast out of the gilded tower, standing on the rain-slicked sidewalk with nothing but a designer suitcase that now felt like a heavy, useless relic. She screamed into her phone, begging her socialite friends and secret contacts for a place to stay, but the line was dead. Every person who had once flattered her now saw her as a ghost. The Mafia-born mistress, who had mocked Zuri for being an outsider, was now the ultimate pariah. Zuri watched the live feed from the security cameras near the Gangnam complex on her tablet. She saw Minhee's silhouette shrinking as she walked away into the dark, her high heels clicking a desperate, lonely rhythm against the asphalt. There was no pity in Zuri's heart, only a profound realization of the world she now inhabited. Seo-jin's love was a fortress, but his rejection was a void from which no one returned. Seo-jin rose from his desk, moving with a slight limp that reminded Zuri of the night she had saved him. He walked over to her, his intense gaze softening as he tucked a loose, natural curl behind her ear. The dragon was back, but he had shed the scales of his previous life. She thought she could touch you and survive, he whispered, his forehead resting against hers. She thought because you were soft, you were weak. She didn't realize that I would rather burn every bridge I ever built than see a single tear in your eyes that I didn't cause with my own stupidity. Zuri reached up, her hand resting against his sharp jawline. You didn't have to go this far, Seo-jin. Taking her status was enough. No, he replied, his voice dropping to a resonant, protective growl. For what she did to you, for the way she made you feel like a ghost in your own home, she deserves to know what it's like to truly be invisible. You are the only Mrs. Han. Everyone else is just noise. He pulled her into a firm, possessive embrace, his heartbeat steady against her own. The vultures were silent, the mistress was gone, and the financial insurance policy had become the soul of the syndicate. As they stood together in the darkened study, Zuri realized that the man who had once said he never wanted her was now a man who couldn't breathe without her. The transformation was absolute, and as the morning sun began to creep over the horizon, the empire they had saved together finally felt like it belonged to them both. The seasons had shifted in Seoul, the oppressive humidity of the summer giving way to a crisp, golden autumn that painted the Han estate in hues of amber and bronze. The glass fortress, once a place of hollow echoes and whispered betrayals, had been transformed. The vultures had been purged, and the memory of the mistress had been swept away like dead leaves. Within the walls of the penthouse, there was a new kind of silence, one born of peace rather than isolation. Seo-jin stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the city he ruled, but his focus was not on the horizon. It was on the reflection of the woman standing behind him. Zuri was dressed in a suit of ivory silk, her posture regal, her deep brown eyes reflecting a wisdom that had been forged in the fires of the last few months. She was no longer just his wife. She was his strategist, his savior, and the only person in the world who truly knew the man beneath the shadow of the dragon. He turned slowly, the charcoal fabric of his suit catching the evening light. He moved without the limp of the previous weeks, his strength fully restored, yet as he looked at Zuri, the intense, dominating presence he projected to the world seemed to melt away. He walked toward her, the space between them closing with a magnetic pull. Without a word, the most powerful man in the Korean underworld did something that would have shocked the syndicates from Seoul to Busan. Han Seojin dropped to one knee before Zuri, his head bowed, his hands reaching out to gently take hers. "Seojin," Zuri whispered, her breath hitching as she looked down at the man who had once refused to even meet her gaze. "I told you on our wedding night that I never wanted you," Seojin began, his voice a low, resonant rumble that vibrated with a raw, unshielded honesty. "I told the world you were a contract. I treated the woman who was meant to be my life's partner like a business transaction. I was a coward, Zuri. I was afraid of the very salvation my father promised me because I didn't think I deserved a heart as clean as yours." He looked up at her then, his sharp features softened by a reverence that brought fresh gloss to Zuri's eyes. "I sat on a throne for years, thinking I was a king, but I was just a man waiting to die in the rain. You didn't just save my life that night, you saved my soul. You showed me that power isn't about who fears you, but about who stands beside you when the world turns dark." He pressed a lingering, tender kiss to the back of her hand, his thumb brushing over the gold band that had once felt like a shackle, but now felt like a promise. "I am sorry, Zuri, for the ghost I made you feel like, for the tears you shed in this room. If I have to spend the rest of my life kneeling to earn the right to stand beside you, I will do it gladly." Zuri felt the last of the old heartaches dissolve, replaced by a warmth that filled the cavernous room. She didn't pull him up immediately. She allowed herself to feel the weight of his apology, the absolute sincerity of his surrender. Then she reached down, her fingers interlacing with his, and pulled him to his feet. "We don't need to look back, Seojin," she said, her voice steady and filled with a quiet power. "The girl who wept on the edge of this bed is gone, and the man who left her here is gone, too. We've built something better on the ruins of their mistakes." Seojin pulled her into his arms, his forehead resting against hers. "A new empire," he murmured, his hands possessive yet gentle on her waist. "A true partnership," she corrected, smiling as she felt his heart beating in sync with hers. An hour later, they stepped out onto the balcony of the Grand Hall, where the entire leadership of the Han Syndicate was gathered for the autumn summit. The air was electric, the lieutenants and elders standing in hushed expectation. In the past, Seojin would have walked 10 paces ahead of her, a king and his decoration. Tonight, they walked side by side. Seojin didn't need to speak to announce the change. The way he held her hand, the way he deferred to her when the financial reports were presented, and the way his eyes never left her spoke volumes. When he finally addressed the room, his voice didn't just carry authority, it carried a warning. "This is Zuri Han," he said, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, silencing every remaining doubt. "She is the heartbeat of this family. She is the mind that saved your assets and the hand that saved my life. To respect me is to respect her. To serve the Han name is to serve her. We are one." The applause that followed was not just out of fear, but out of a newfound awe for the couple that had redefined the syndicate's power. As Zuri looked out over the city, she realized her father had been right. She was untouchable. But it wasn't because of a contract or a blood debt. It was because she had found a man who would burn the world to keep her safe, and she had found the strength within herself to lead him through the fire. The glass fortress was no longer a prison. It was the foundation of a new legacy. And as the moon rose over Seoul, the Korean Mafia boss and his Black Queen stood together, undisputed and unbreakable, at the dawn of their new empire.